Welcome, Dr. Tomlinson. Thanks for spending some time with us today to talk about your new book, Differentiation in the Brain.
Thanks. My privilege to be with you.
Please tell us a little bit about differentiation in the brain.
The book is an attempt really to help teachers understand a significant and growing body of evidence that suggests to us that learners don't come in a match set like luggage does. Kids come to school quite differently. Their differences are influenced by genetics and opportunity and development and culture and gender and many other aspects. And we've known many of those things through research on classroom psychology for a number of years. But this book gives us a chance to look at a new and growing area of evidence, and that is what we're learning about the brain. I don't think anyone who studies the brain thinks that we're through understanding that knowledge yet. Our knowledge is young, and yet many times what I'm interested in seeing is how our knowledge, growing knowledge of the brain, ultimately actually reinforces what we have observed in terms of psychological research. So this is an instance where you have two authors, one of whom is very knowledgeable about the science of the brain, my colleague Dr Seuss, and my area of knowledge is differentiated instruction. And what we are hoping to do here is to help teachers see how our increasing knowledge of the brain can more appropriately inform their classroom instruction in terms of attending to different learners' readiness needs, their interest, and the ways that they approach learning or learning profile. And to my knowledge, this is the first time that those two areas have come together to share that new insight with classroom teachers.
How did you get involved with Dr. Seuss in this project?
I actually had the opportunity to work with Dr. Seuss on this project because we had presented together at a conference in Australia and serendipitously ended up flying back next to each other on the airplane. And in conversation, which is a very long opportunity for conversation coming back from Australia, we talked about a number of things, including the work that he was doing and the work that I was doing. And the idea for the project initially really was his. He asked if I would be interested in joining him in a book on differentiation in the brain. And it seemed both interesting and important to me. I knew it was something that would teach me, and believe even then and certainly do now that the collaboration is something that can be really helpful to classroom teachers as well.
Can you elaborate on the correlation between educational neuroscience and differentiated instruction?
Well, of course, children all come to school equipped with a brain, obviously, and what we're looking at is what our knowledge of the brain can really help us understand in terms of classroom performance and what teachers can do to enhance that performance. So, for example, in the field of differentiation with the model that I've used, research from the standpoint of psychology for decades really has suggested to us three areas in which student differences can profoundly impact learning in the case of some students. And that is their readiness to learn what they're asked to learn at a particular point. The second area is their interest, how interest can impact learning. And the third area that psychological research has shown us is how students or people's different approaches to learning can impact their success as learners. So one of the ways that we looked at differentiation in this new book is to say, what is the brain telling us about readiness? And what is it telling us about students' interest? Do those things matter? And what about the issue of learning profile or how people approach learning? What do we know there? And so, for example, again, in those three areas, which are just a small piece of what we looked at, but they are seminal in terms of helping us understand student differences from past research, what we find is that, in fact, the brain does tell us that readiness is particularly important. It suggests to us pretty clearly that when students are experiencing learning that is way past their readiness level, they simply can't learn. It feels threatening. They begin to shut down and actually are the brain is more invested in protecting itself, in protecting the human in which it resides, than it is in trying to understand what the teacher at the blackboard is saying, because the task doesn't seem possible. On the flip side of the coin, what the brain tells us is that a student can be sitting in front of a teacher and can make straight A's on tests, but if that student doesn't really have to stretch, if they don't have to grow, the brain is not functioning in a learning mode particularly well either. And so what we come to understand from the brain is really not terribly different than what we came to understand from psychological research, the work of people like Vygotsky and people in the field of reading and a number of other areas, and that is that work needs to be moderately challenging, moderately stressful for a student in order to learn. And of course, the problem in a classroom is that what's moderately challenging for one student may not at all be for another. But the brain does give us pretty clear indication that readiness really matters. Likewise, we see in the brain that when students find work interesting, when it taps their particular proclivities, when it's relevant for them, in other words, when it's interesting, their motivation to learn is higher, and that achievement attaches to motivation. And so when students are motivated to learn something because it does seem relevant or engaging or pertinent to their particular dreams or strengths, they learn more willingly and, not surprisingly, then generally more effectively. The area of learning profile is a term that I've used in the model of differentiation that I've worked with, and it suggests to us that how people approach learning may be affected by multiple indicators. One is that gender may affect how we learn. It's not that all boys or all girls learn in the same way, but there are patterns, we believe, from psychological research within genders. And likewise, culture impacts how we learn. Again, not all people from any particular culture learn exactly alike, but we do believe that there's some patterns within and across cultures that can impact learning. This area of the three, in other words, learning profile as compared to readiness and interest, the brain gives us a little more dissonance in terms of our understanding. And not all brain researchers or neuroscientists or translators of neuroscientists are in exactly the same place with this understanding. What we probably do know is that people learn in different ways, and that those ways can be impacted by a number of factors. What we probably don't know as fully as we once thought we did is exactly how that works. And probably a good conclusion that neuroscientists would point us toward now is that the brain is pretty plastic, and it's not the case that a particular learner is one kind of learner. We learn in different ways under different circumstances with different contexts, different needs. And so perhaps a valid conclusion at this point is that it's a good idea to help students experience learning in a variety of ways, perhaps because that impacts capacity to remember information, and ultimately to help students understand ways in which they can approach learning and to develop the capacity to determine what's working well for them and what's not, and how to select alternate approaches when something isn't working. Again, that's just a small piece of the framework that we use together to look at the ideas of neuroscience and learning, but it gives you a little bit of an idea of what some of the intersections might be.
How do the mindsets of teachers and students affect differentiation?
The concept of mindset, all of us, of course, use that word in conversational tones. What's your mindset about the weather? But there is a specific term in psychology used by Carol Dweck, who's a noted researcher in the field of learner motivation. And she uses the term mindset to refer to a particular set of learning that has accumulated throughout her lengthy career in regard to student motivation. And she suggests to us that fairly early on in life, students and all human beings adapt a particular mindset about learning and sort of answering the question, who's going to be successful as a learner? Who's going to be good at this learning thing? And students or young people develop one of two mindsets, she says, in this regard. One is what she calls a growth mindset, and one is what she calls a fixed mindset. People who have a fixed mindset, and this is true for teachers, it's true for students, it's true for administrators, it's true for parents, true for citizens. Any of those folks who have a fixed mindset say, you know what, I can tell you who's going to be successful. People who are successful are people who are smart. And smart comes from heredity, and it comes then a little bit, is shaped somewhat after heredity by environment. And the bottom line there is some people have the environment and the heredity to be smart in school, and others really don't so much. It's important for teachers to teach kids really well, no matter who they are. But the truth of the matter is some kids are smart in subjects, some kids aren't smart in subjects, and so at the end of the day, some kids will learn and some won't learn so well. People with a growth mindset take a very different vantage point. They say, I can tell you who's going to be successful academically in these sorts of pursuits, and it's not the person who has the genetics pool or the environment. It's the person who works the hardest. What really is going to make the difference is the person who's willing to invest the sweat in their work. In other words, effort can override or greatly modify heredity and environment. And so it's not that you're born to be smart or born to be not smart. The question is, how hard are you willing to work in whatever the pursuit is that you have? And Dweck's work suggests very strongly, as does that of many other people, that in fact it's correct that effort can make a major, major difference in students' academic success. A student who has a fixed mindset concludes fairly soon that there's only so much you can do in school to support your success. If you're smart, it's going to be fairly easy for you. If you're not smart, it's not going to be, and there's really not much you can do there. Students with a fluid mindset come at it very differently, and that is, I can exercise my brain in the same way that I exercise my body. And just like my body will continue to get stronger and stronger as I exercise it, so will my brain. So if you give me good feedback to show me what I'm not doing so well and help me understand how I can do better, it's within my grasp to do that. A dangerous thing, of course, is when you have a teacher with a fixed mindset and a student with a fixed mindset, because the teacher looks at a student and says, you are who you are, whether I perceive you to be extremely bright or extremely much a struggler in this area. That's sort of your self-fulfilling prophecy. And so I think there's a pretty good chance that teachers teach less eagerly and aggressively if they believe some students will get it and some won't. Teachers who believe that all students can learn, if the teacher can help them find the right way and can encourage their effort, come at their work quite differently. So one of the things that we discuss in the book is what the implications are for teachers with fixed mindsets and students with fixed mindsets. And by the way, as opposed to teachers and or students with growth mindsets or fluid mindsets. And by the way, the concept of a fixed mindset is as disabling or crippling many times for a very advanced learner as it is for a struggling learner. Because kids who learn very quickly and have a fixed mindset tend to believe that if you are born to be smart, you're going to be smart, and you don't really have to work to get there. And often school reinforces this sense because they can sort of coast and with modest effort do really, really well. Then when someone provides them with a challenge and actually expects them to do more than they've seen themselves doing, it's often very difficult for those students because their sense is that if you're smart, you don't really have to work hard on things. And the fact that this teacher is asking them to do something that will require extensive effort, they feel, is sort of an indictment suggesting that they're not smart. And so kids and teachers benefit from really understanding the idea of mindset, examining their own mindsets, and particularly what we need is to have adults, teachers, and parents alike who work with kids to help them understand that our fate academically is typically within our control. And the way we continue to get smarter and the way we continue to succeed is not assuming that our birthright's going to take care of it for us, but rather that our investment of continual, prolonged, and focused effort, in other words, effort that we exert in wise ways, is what it is that will help us grow.
What is the best way for an educator to use this book?
You know, educators are just like kids, and so I'm not real sure that there is one best way for educators to use the book. It has a number of good possibilities because of the format. It introduces many chapters with a scenario that may be a little more typical of how we see school and how we do school particularly. And then as the chapter goes on and presents new information, it concludes with a scenario that would be more appropriate to enact in classrooms if we understood the message that has come in the chapter. In other words, if we wrap around the information that has been provided in that chapter. I think one intriguing way for teachers to use the book is really just to look at those beginning scenarios and determine the degree to which that sounds sort of like their classroom. And if we're honest, the beginning scenarios sound an awful lot like all of us. I taught for 20 years and have long since concluded that whatever the mistakes were to be made in a classroom, I have made my share on more than my share of days. So it's not a question of trying to judge and saying, are you a good teacher or a bad teacher, but rather what's your starting point right now. And if those beginning scenarios seem perhaps a little familiar, then it would be kind of interesting to read a chapter and talk with yourself, have an internal monologue about what it would take for your classroom to move to the concluding scenario rather than the beginning one. And toward that end, within each chapter, there are questions for teachers to answer and rating scales for themselves to sort of check where their particular strengths and needs and new ideas are, which can provide guidance for them. Certainly it would be interesting for people at a particular grade level to get together and discuss parts or all of the book, or in particular subject areas at the secondary level. Some of the parts of the book would be really great discussion tools for whole schools. What is our mindset as a school, and how do we reflect that to students? And when we define differentiation, to what degree do we emphasize readiness versus interest versus learning profile? What's the nature of school environment as a whole for kids, and how does that impact learning? And what's the nature of the learning environment in my classroom, and how might that impact learning as well? So I think there are numerous possibilities for individual study, for study in small groups, and for school-wide study. And if David and I got parts of it right, what we hope is that this book, like books that continue to help us grow, would not be something that a teacher or a grade level or a district or a school would visit just once and check that off the list and say, okay, now we finished, but rather that they would continue to use it as sort of a touchstone for thinking about their own practice individually, again, and in small groups and as larger groups, and coming back to it over and over, sort of say, okay, what points have we been working with, which ones might we have overlooked, where can we see growth in ourselves, and what steps might we take next.
What do you think is the most important message from Differentiation in the Brain?
I think for me the most important message is the teacher message. It's the message that I think we have evidence that teachers have known was true for a really long time. We know things sometimes in our classrooms simply because of the power of the students who surround us. And I can't imagine many teachers over the years who have said, yep, got 25 or 30 kids in my class and they're all on the same page every day. They come in just alike. I don't think that's ever really been true for thoughtful teachers. And it's certainly not true in contemporary classrooms where diversity of gender and culture and experience and opportunity and approaches to learning are arguably the greatest in the history of the world. So for me, the most important message really is to say to teachers, when you look out there and you see those differences and you think the differences in learners may be impacting learning, what the brain is suggesting to us is you're exactly right. And now, because we have a deeper understanding, we can look a little bit more in detail at what we should be doing in classrooms to encourage learning and what practices and thoughts we might do well to shed because they really impede learning. For me, the punchline in the book is kids differ. Here's some evidence, and here's some guidance of things that you might be able to do in order to reach those learners as well as possible. My hope, and I think the hope of most teachers, is that we do the very best job possible that we can with each student, because no two of those lives are alike. None of them is replaceable. And if you're a great believer in the power of the teacher, then you believe that all of us who teach touch kids for better or for worse. We send them away from us as better students and stronger people, or more discouraged students with a less certain course in life. And so our hope is that the book can help people understand a little bit better how to deal with those complexities in the classroom and provide a little bit more evidence of the importance of the need to deal with those differences in the classroom.
Thank you for sharing your insights into differentiation in the brain. Is there anything you would like to add or expand upon?
No, I appreciate the opportunity to talk with some solution tree readers and hope that they will find the book useful. And if you have questions or suggestions for David and me, let us know. We learn from the people who hopefully learn from us.
Thank you for your time today, Dr. Tomlinson.
You're welcome.